Mia stood motionless in the kitchen, her hand clutching the counter as the moon shone through the window. Daniel spoke in a low, nearly whispery voice behind her. "Mia, you have always been important to me, more than I ought to toys." The warmth of his touch sent goosebumps down her spine, causing her breath to catch when his hand touched hers. As the distance between them vanished, she turned to face him, her heart racing. Mia never imagined that her relationship with Daniel, her stepdad, would be anything other than kind. Although he was always supportive and courteous, their relationship had remained superficial because he had married her mother when she was 16. He was their family's rock-solid, dependable member who kept to himself, but was always there when they needed him. However, things had begun to change over time. Daniel and Mia frequently found themselves alone in the house due to her mom's extended work hours. It started out casually, with light talk over dinner and shared giggles watching a television program. However, there had been times lately when things had lasted longer than they ought to have. Mia arrived home from her night class late one evening, wired but fatigued. In the kitchen, she discovered Daniel with a drink of whiskey and a thoughtful expression on his face. "Hard day," she said, putting her purse aside. He nodded and gave a slight smile. "That's what you could say." "There has been a lot of work lately." Leaning against the counter, Mia poured herself a glass of water. "Mom is still working after hours?" "Yes," Daniel said in a quiet voice. "She hardly ever comes home these days." She paused when she heard a hint of melancholy, perhaps loneliness, in his voice. Her brow furrowed as she said, "Are you okay?" After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "I'm all right. I guess I'm just exhausted." The air between them felt electrified for a minute as their eyes locked, as though there was something unsaid at stake. The festering tension eventually boiled over a week later. Mia heard Daniel enter the living room late at night while she was up completing an assignment. She entered out of curiosity and discovered him reading a book on the couch. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "Something like that," he replied, setting the book aside. They fell into an easy conversation, but as the minutes passed, the mood shifted. Daniel's gaze lingered on hers, his expression unreadable. "You've grown up so much, Mia," he said suddenly, his voice low. She laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "Well, that's what happens over time." "No, I mean it," he insisted, his tone serious. "You've become this incredible woman. I'm proud of you." Her cheeks flushed, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Daniel. That means a lot." There was a pause, the silence thick with unspoken words. Then, almost hesitantly, he said, "You know, I've always cared about you, more than I probably should." Mia's breath caught as his words sank in. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling. "What are you saying?" He stood, pacing the room as if trying to find the right words. "I'm saying that you've become someone I can't stop thinking about. And I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her heart raced as she tried to process what he was saying. We can't." "I know," he interrupted, his tone raw. "But tell me you haven't felt it too." She didn't answer, but the way her eyes dropped to the floor was all the confirmation he needed. Daniel stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him, her lips parting as she whispered, "I can't." The space between them disappeared as Daniel cupped her face, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was hesitant at first, but quickly deepened. Mia's hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer as the intensity of their connection overwhelmed her. "You're incredible," he murmured against her lips, his hands sliding to her waist. "And you're trouble," she replied, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desire. The night unfolded in a whirlwind of passion, the boundaries between them dissolving as they gave in to what they had both been denying for so long. Every touch, every whispered word carried the weight of their forbidden connection, and neither of them could bring themselves to stop. Daniel guided her to the couch, his hands gentle but confident as he explored the curves of her body. The warmth of his touch sent shivers down her spine, and she felt her own hands instinctively reach for him, pulling him closer. The flickering light of the television cast soft shadows across the room, cocooning them in a world where only they existed. Mia stirred to the soft sound of birds outside the window. She blinked, her heart sinking as she realized she'd fallen asleep on the couch. The events of the night before came rushing back, and a wave of guilt and uncertainty washed over her. Daniel was already awake, sitting in the chair across from her, his face unreadable. "Morning," he said softly, his tone tentative. "Morning," she replied, sitting up and wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. We need to talk." "I know," he said, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. "Last night it wasn't just a mistake, Mia. It meant something to me." Her chest tightened at his words. "But what about Mom? What about us? It can't happen again." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know, but I don't regret it, not for a second." Before either of them could say more, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Mia's stomach drop. "She's home early," she whispered, panic flashing across her face. Daniel stood quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm. As her mom walked through the door, greeting them with a bright smile, Mia and Daniel exchanged a fleeting glance, a silent acknowledgement of the secret they now shared. But as the days passed, the memory of that night refused to fade. And while they both vowed to move forward, the weight of their connection lingered, unspoken but undeniably present. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of that night lingered in the corners of Mia's mind, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every time Daniel walked into the room, her pulse quickened, her thoughts clouded with guilt and longing. He avoided her gaze when her mother was around, but when they were alone, the tension between them was suffocating. Mia tried to focus on her studies, her friends, anything to distract herself from the growing weight of their secret. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept returning to him, the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd touched her, the way he'd made her feel alive in a way she hadn't before. One afternoon, Mia came home early from class, the house unusually quiet. She set her bag down and headed toward the kitchen, stopping short when she saw Daniel standing at the sink, his hands gripping the counter. "Hey," she said softly, her voice startling him. He turned, his expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "You're home early." "Class ended early," she said, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been trying to make sense of everything." Mia hesitated, her heart pounding as she stepped even closer. "Daniel, I can't stop thinking about that night." His gaze snapped to hers, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Mia, don't," he said, his voice low and strained. "We can't do this." "But we already did," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you can't tell me you don't think about it, too." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Of course I think about it," he admitted. "But that doesn't make it right." The room was thick with tension as Mia reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "What if we stopped fighting it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel froze at her touch, his breath hitching. "Mia, you don't understand what you're saying." "I do," she insisted, stepping closer until they were mere inches apart. "I know this is complicated and I know it's wrong, but I also know how I feel and I know you feel it too." His resolve faltered as her words sank in. "Mia," he whispered, his voice cracking, "this could ruin everything." "Then why are you still standing here?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Why haven't you walked away?" He didn't answer, but the way his hand moved to cup her face said everything she needed to know. His lips met hers in a kiss that was desperate and full of all the emotions they'd been trying to suppress. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. They gave in completely. The world outside their secret shattering into nothing. The sunlight streamed through the curtains as Mia stirred, the events of the night before rushing back. She turned to find Daniel already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the quiet. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of tenderness and anguish. "We need to figure this out," he said. "Because if this keeps happening, it's going to destroy us and your mom." Mia sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't want to stop." Daniel looked at her, his gaze heavy with emotion. "Neither do I," he said quietly. "But we have to, Mia, for her." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Mia's heart raced as her mother's voice called out, cheerful and unsuspecting. I'm home. Anyone here? Daniel stood quickly, his face pale as he began gathering his clothes. You need to act normal, he said, his voice urgent, like nothing happened. Mia nodded, her chest tightening as she dressed hurriedly. When they stepped into the kitchen, her mother greeted them with a bright smile, oblivious to the tension crackling between them. But as the days passed, it became harder to pretend. The stolen glances, the lingering touches when no one was looking, it was only a matter of time before their secret threatened to unravel. One evening, as Mia sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, her mom entered with a concerned expression. "Can we talk?" she asked, her tone serious. Mia's stomach dropped. "Sure," she said, setting her phone aside. Her mom sat beside her, her eyes searching Mia's face. "Is everything okay between you and Daniel? I've noticed things seem different." Mia forced a laugh, shaking her head. "What do you mean?" Her mom hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I don't know. He's been distant lately, and you seem distracted. If there's something going on, you can tell me." Mia's chest tightened as she tried to maintain her composure. "Nothing's going on, Mom. Everything's fine." Her mom nodded slowly, though her concern lingered. "If you say so. But you know you can tell me anything, right?" "Of course," Mia said, her smile forced as guilt churned in her stomach. As her mom walked away, Mia let out a shaky breath, the weight of their secret pressing down on her. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. But one thing was clear. The deeper they went, the harder it would be to find their way back. The tension in the house grew unbearable as the days passed. Mia's heart raced whenever Daniel was near, her mother's presence a constant reminder of the line they had crossed. They tried to avoid each other, but the pull between them was undeniable. One evening, as Mia sat in her room staring at the ceiling, there was a soft knock at the door. Her pulse quickened. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Daniel stepped in, closing the door quietly behind him. His face was a mix of guilt and longing. "Mia," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." She sat up, her eyes locked on his. "About what?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. Whatever this is between us, it's out of control. I can't stop thinking about you, and it's tearing me apart." Mia stood, her heart pounding as she crossed the room to stand in front of him. "Do you think it's any easier for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Every time I see you, She stopped herself, her emotions overwhelming her. Daniel's eyes darkened, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Mia, we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice strained. "But I can't stay away from you either." Before either of them could say another word, their emotions boiled over. Daniel cupped her face, his lips crashing into hers in a kiss that was desperate and filled with every suppressed feeling they'd tried to bury. Mia responded immediately, her hands gripping his shirt as she pulled him closer. "Daniel," she murmured between kisses, her breath hitching as his hand slid to her waist. "This is crazy." "I know," he whispered against her lips, his voice thick with desire. "But I don't care anymore." The world outside faded as they gave in completely, their movements fueled by a mix of passion and defiance. Daniel lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bed as their connection deepened, their boundaries dissolving. Just as their passion reached its peak, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted them back to reality. Mia froze, her heart stopping as she realized her mother was home. "She's back early," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. Daniel's eyes widened as he quickly gathered his clothes, his movements frantic. "We need to act normal," he said, his voice urgent. Mia nodded, her hands trembling as she adjusted her clothes and tried to calm her racing heart. Moments later, her mother's voice called out from downstairs. "I'm home! Are you two here?" Daniel stepped closer, his hand brushing hers one last time. "This isn't over," he said softly, his gaze holding hers. She nodded, unable to speak as he slipped out of the room. As her mother entered the house, Mia and Daniel exchanged a fleeting glance, their secret simmering just beneath the surface. But the weight of their choices was undeniable, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The storm they had created was far from over.